on the Carnegie Classification and the connection between community engagement and internationalization. So I also appreciate very much that our two speakers here log in at a very early time on their side of the big lake. And without further ado, I stop my sharing and the screen is yours, Georgina and Matthew. And please switch on your microphone.
Hello, thank you so much. And thank you, Wim, for this great segue to our presentation. Can you see the slides okay? Uwe, can you give us a hint that this is working?
I cannot see anything. No, I'm just kidding. I'm getting tired and I have to make jokes. I see it perfectly. Everything is fine. Thank you.
You're tired, we're sleepy, we're gonna get through this.
That is what everybody did with their session so far. So, follow up on a tough lead. Go ahead.
I hope our participants had a good day today. My name is Georgina and I'm here with my colleague Matthew Johnson, and we're excited to tell you about this project we were working on and about its transition. So we're gonna try to talk a little quickly so we can keep some more time for the Q&A. So we'll go through an overview of the IHES project design, and I will cover the design part. Matthew will cover the implementation and future part. So I'm the Assistant Director for Research and Assessment at the Swearer Center for Public Service at Brown University in Rhode Island in the United States. I'm a US-based Lebanese scholar, and my background is in international development and nonprofit management, university community partnerships, and social policies in West Asia. So a little bit about Brown and the Swearer before we begin. Brown is a private Ivy League research university that was founded in 1764. It is in the northeastern region of the United States. We have around 10,000 students and over 800 faculty members. Our global partnership model is partnership-based, it's not transactional, and we center bidirectionality in our engagement with partners globally. And are intentional and about our positionality and history in the world. The Swearer Center at Brown, where I'm based, is the community engagement hub and administrative and research home for the Carnegie Classification between 2017 and 2020, which is the project we're talking about today. So this project started at Brown and has since moved to Albion College. It started before Brown, but the design of it, of the international element of it, was under the Swearer Center. So the Carnegie Classification, you might know about the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. They've introduced the credit hour. They also have a basic classification of higher education institutions based on different characteristics like the type of educational programming or the type of research activity. In addition to this classification that the team at the Carnegie Foundation builds based on a national data set, they introduced a special purpose elective classification where campuses and institutions can voluntarily opt into being evaluated. It's kind of like a self-study or an accreditation process that is meant to articulate whether or not these campuses are following some agreed upon best practices in community engagement and institutionalizing community engagement in their institutions. So the first version of this classification started with a pilot in 2005, led by Amy Driscoll, who was an affiliated scholar with the foundation at the time, and 13 universities. It was also based on literature in the field of community engagement at the time and emerging best practices from what people were doing at the time of the pilot. We have since had classification cycles in 2006, 8, 10, 15, and most recently in 2020. And with every cycle, the application itself gets improved, gets additional questions that are newly relevant or things that we're missing and things that cover emerging trends in our field. Then after a campus submits an application, this is reviewed by a national review panel of scholars and practitioners in the field, and you're classified if you show a high level of alignment within the framework's areas of best practice. It's not a one-time award. It's the idea of it is continuous improvement, both of the framework itself and the bar that we have for this best practice, and of institutions and how they're meeting these goals. So there's a reclassification process and a reapplication that is now every 6 years. There's no ranking in this type of work. You just have it or you don't. We're not trying to create competition. This is like a best practice that we're hoping campuses would work on. So the main contribution of the classification has been to offer a unified definition of community engagement. We may not all agree on every specific thing here, but as a framework for how we do this work and what the expectation is and what the purpose is, this has been a helpful guiding framework in the US-based context. So I will quickly read through this. Community engagement describes the collaboration between institutions of higher education and their larger communities, whether local, regional, state, national, or global, for the mutually beneficial exchange of knowledge and resources in a context of partnership and reciprocity. And you see partnership and reciprocity and like mutual benefit are at the core of what exactly is the process of engagement. Then when we think about the purpose of engagement, which is the second part of this definition, that's where the S and IHES is so clearly defined. So why exactly do we do that? The purpose of this engagement is the partnership of the college and university knowledge and resources with those of the public and private sector. And what you'll see in this breakdown of purposes is that some of the purpose is internal to the institution, and a major portion of it is external to the community, which is part of that reciprocal exchange. So to enrich scholarship, research, and creative activity, enhance curriculum, teaching and learning, prepare educated, engaged citizens, strengthen democratic values and civic responsibility, address critical societal issues, and contribute to the public good. And again, the wording of that might be social responsibility in different contexts or different names in different places. But again, the idea is this reciprocal exchange. The impact in the US of this classification has been, again, to help unify language and offer this definition to contribute to a consolidation and articulation of a field. We have a field for engaged scholarship and community engagement. We have practitioners and experts and scholars who work on it. There's journals associated with it, conferences and learning communities for people who work in it. And there's been a national learning community that kind of uses this framework to have conversations and to move the conversations forward, and to also critique the framework itself so we can continue to improve it. And we continue to invite people and practitioners in this field to offer us input on how we can move this forward. So this has been a tool pushing for transformational change on campuses, again, rethinking why we do the work we do and how we can link our education and research to the betterment of the society at large. So this transformative success in the US has led to calls for an international classification from global partners, and Matthew will speak a little bit more about what that looked like. One of the main channels through which we got this demand is through the Talwar Network Leaders Conference, which is a conference that happens every 2 or 3 years by a network of international universities committed to civic engagement. And as a result of the 2014 conference in Cape Town, we had a small pilot project in Ireland with 9 campuses in the country who worked together as a learning community. And it was the first model of this kind of cohort-based, country-based model. And this has informed our internationalization. A few other kind of key guiding values and principles that we've introduced in the design of this international project is that knowledge does not only exist in the academy, that knowledge is not just the higher education institution. There's knowledge and expertise in the community. That knowledge is not just in the West, whether the US or Europe. There's knowledge elsewhere, and we need to find ways and resources to translate knowledge elsewhere if we do not have the capacity to understand it. And that knowledge is power, and that imposing universalist ideological frameworks is a colonial practice. So how do we engage with a locally relevant global classification project with these values in mind? And I will pass the baton to Matthew to talk about implementation.
Thank you, Georgina. Georgina and I have been colleagues for a number of years, and recently I moved from Brown to a new institution. You can move forward, Georgina. This is Albion College. We are a small Methodist liberal arts undergraduate institution with a mixed history of both colonial settlement and liberation pedagogy. We are becoming a majority non-white institution next year. We're located in a post-industrial city in the Midwest that has been really hollowed out by deindustrialization. Many of our residents in the city are descendants of the Great Migration of Black sharecroppers from the South to populate the factories in the North. And we have become sort of a hyper-local anchor institution because we are now the largest employer and the sort of engine of economic development. So much of our work is centered around local economic development. More broadly, we did just become part of a climate commitment in the United States where college presidents and university presidents can sign a commitment to reduce their carbon footprint. Our goal is to be the first university or college in the state of Michigan that is carbon neutral, perhaps as soon as next year. We have an extremely global alumni base involved all across the world because we've been in existence since the 1800s, 1835, I think is when we were founded. We now are the home of the Carnegie Foundation elective classifications. They moved here with me, and Georgina will continue to collaborate with me on them, but they've become part of our public purpose mission here at Albion. And we believe the elective classifications are about highlighting the public purpose of higher education. So just to walk you through how this technology of change works. As Georgina mentioned, it is a self-study that institutions go through. They begin by surfacing offices and actors at their institution who are deeply engaged in community engagement across the institution. They then develop an institutional understanding. They use that institutional understanding to apply for the classification. And then after they are either classified or not, they set a strategy to continue the improvement, either to gain the classification in the next round or to continue their forward movement, because the classification is not a permanent designation. They will have to reclassify in a number of years. It also is a sectoral change process, because as we go through the process, we discover across institutions new approaches to community engagement, and we take those and iterate them on the framework or the application for the next round. We also disseminate those best practices across the field. So it gives us a way to excavate the development of best practices. It's also a field building tool because it connects, as Georgina mentioned, with common language, intellectual frameworks, and practices. And that's been a very powerful element in the US. Go ahead. So as Georgina mentioned, we've had some push to internationalize beginning in 2014 in the Talwar's meeting. We started with a thought to do two models. One was a global model of 5 unconnected institutions in different nations or regions. And at the 2016 Talwar's meeting, 2 regional cohorts emerged, and we decided to go in that direction. So the 2 regional cohorts or national cohorts committed to this process, where we had an MOU and a letter of intent. We had monthly calls for support. We had systematic and regular reflection prompts. We did initial convening, a midpoint convening, and we will do a closing convening across a 2-year process. Cohorts committed to work together to apply through the US framework, and as they did, note where it needed to be changed, adapted, and decide later on if it was deemed desirable to create their own framework for their own national contexts. These are the Canadian institutions here in pink, quite a few institutions across Canada. We had a 5-day opening training in Vancouver. We've done monthly calls, two organizational visits, and a midpoint gathering in Calgary. But then COVID happened, and that slowed the process down. The group has continued moving forward. They are completing their applications. They should be in by December. Then we will do site visits in 2021. The group has decided to move forward to build their own classification for Canada. So there will be a Carnegie Canada that would launch in 2022. The Australian cohort, somewhat culturally different, is moving much more quickly. They had a 3-day opening training. We did the monthly support calls and a midpoint gathering in Bathurst, but their submissions have already started. And in fact, there's only one of the schools left to submit. The cluster at the bottom of the slide are the schools who are fully participating. The cluster at the top are observer schools who are watching the process and learning about the process should an Australian framework be launched, which will be launched because their submissions are complete, the virtual site visits are underway, and they've already started drafting their version of the framework, including a governance structure to launch in 2021. Here you can see the governance structure that they've already built and how that governance structure is a partnership with the US Carnegie framework. I'm not going to go through all the text here. You'll have the slides as a way to review, but suffice it to say that they have built a very robust partnership and national community of practice and governance framework. We also, in the fall of 2019, before COVID, held a convening sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. 15 African institutions and 1 Pakistani institution participated. They were very interested in us developing the same kinds of pilots in the African continent, on the African continent. South Africa, perhaps chief among them. We've also had interest from Malaysia and Indonesia. We are just now waiting for COVID to subside so that we can re-engage in the internationalization project. So lessons learned, the framework and technology of change represented by the classification is transferable. The core definition is very important and remains high fidelity in both cases. The sector and the community of practice develop in Australia and Canada in the same way they did in the US. Adaptation is needed, of course, in the cultural contexts where it is deployed, and that the internationalization is helping us improve the US version. A little bit of difference between Canadians and Australians that I've learned, and if there are Canadians or Australians on the call, they will understand quickly what I'm about to say. But I like to say metaphorically that if you're going for a hiking trip, the Canadians lay out the supplies a week in advance, and every night before bed, they count the number of socks and the number of chocolate bars and they weigh the coffee that's going in the backpack. Meanwhile, the day you leave, the Australians are still not around until the moment you step outside, and then they come flying by you on the back of a horse, bareback with no saddle, saying, what's the holdup here? It's a very different cultural experience. They move quickly. Canadians are very deliberative and consultative. And that was kind of fun to learn. Indigenization is also a really interesting thing that's come out of this. In both cases, both national contexts are indigenizing higher education, and we are learning a lot from them about that. And then finally, that the differences that are at first thought of between higher education contexts melt away through a process like this. And what you discover is that the words may be different, but the infrastructure and organization of institutions of higher education are really very similar in many ways. Thanks, and we'll take some questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, actually, when I heard about it, it was, of course, extremely interesting because when we started our study, the first thing we identified was there is no kind of structural concept of the idea yet. And yet there are projects out there. And then on the other hand, you have the Carnegie Classification going, which now looks specifically also at internationalizing it. What I find interesting is, apart from the internationalizing of the classification itself, in how far does it differ whether an institution includes international perspectives they have themselves already, like international scholars in contrast to the domestic scholars, international students in contrast to the domestic students in this community engagement problem or whole setting. So what is your experience there? Maybe also at your two institutions, at Brown and at Albion. I can imagine, we heard it from different session presentations, that involving, for example, an international community in activities in the local community can be quite challenging and much more or much different from the community engagement of the domestic students and staff. Is there some experience on your side how that also afflicts then the classification process?
Well, Hugh, there is a section of the classification that asks institutions to articulate other institutional commitments. And if an institution articulates a commitment that it is an internationalized or internationalizing institution, then we ask a series of questions that ask them to tell us how community engagement is integrated into their internationalization efforts. We ask a similar question around diversity and inclusion. If diversity and inclusion is a main thrust of their organization, then we expect to see community engagement built deeply into that organizational commitment. So really, we start with asking, what are your other organizational commitments? And if you are a community engaged institution, we expect to see community engagement embedded in those other institutional commitments, of one of which could be internationalization.
Excellent. Actually, we have also a lot of questions coming up now. Yeah, you achieved your goal. Nobody got tired. Quite the opposite. The most difficult one I asked first from Justina. It is, Matthew, great cultural comparison of Canadians and Australians. I would like to ask the Canadians and Australians what they say, but whatever. But she says, where are the Americans on the backpack scale?
That's a great question. We're somewhere in between. We think we've got it all planned out. We usually don't. We usually forget something. We laugh at the Canadians for planning too much, and we laugh at the Australians for not planning enough. And then we're the ones who are left neither prepared like the Canadians nor capable like the Australians.
That is a nice. I was thinking of situations in Europe, and we had this very nice poster of European perspectives where they made jokes of every stereotype you had about a European, and one of that was humorous as a German, which I took quite some insult and offense, but not really. Okay, thanks for that. But we have other questions here quickly. One is from Mark Dawson. Do you already have partners from the UK? I would suggest, if you do, type it. If not, say it.
We do not currently have active partners in the UK, but are very interested in having a UK cohort go through the same process.
Okay. Then we have one, actually two quick questions from Wim Gabriels. That's, how do you motivate institutions to go through the process? And how do you think you would push progress in the European context? And I keep the other question for a bit later. So how do you get them to do it?
Yeah, in the US, institutions do it because it's seen as an emblem of a badge of honor or a badge of quality. It's seen as a standard that institutions want to be able to brag about, that they are in the elite group of institutions who have achieved this classification. In the US, there are somewhere around 4,500 higher education institutions, colleges and universities, and only 300 so far have achieved it.
Okay, that answers that question, and that leads to the one of Alejandra Gonzalez from the Universidad Sabana. She says, thank you, and now it's gone.
Sorry, she asked how we can learn more.
Yeah, that's good. Go ahead.
I just typed the website, and you can see it in the answered questions.
Yeah, splendid, splendid. I love that. Another quick one is from Jonathan Kaplan. Have you published guidelines to help institutions go through the classification process?
Georgina?
Yes, we have published guidelines. We have a book in the US on the elective classification. And maybe Uwe, since you've shared that folks will get the PDFs, we can add a little more, like a longer list of references, so that when people receive this, you can actually, I mean, we highlighted the specific book chapter that we most recently published about this. There is another book that has like several different examples of institutions in the US who have done this with a deep reflection on the process, including a campus that was not successful. So we will make sure to include all of these references for you to learn more. We also had, I would say, over 20 in-person training sessions in the US context over the last 2 years before the classification was due in 2020. And we've done similar work in other institutions. Some of that is published on the website that we shared, in addition to some of the book chapters that are also publicly available. So we will make sure to include all of these references.
Splendid.
In the links.
We will send out a request to all the presenters afterwards, because also my experience is it doesn't help much to ask for the presentation before the event, because usually one does last minute changes 2 minutes before you start your presentation. So the last question for today would then be, again, the second one from Wim. How does the Carnegie classification relate to the concept of service learning?
So it can be that service learning fits the definition of community engagement. However, service learning can also happen as not fitting the definition of community engagement. If you go back to the definition slides that Georgina started with, there are some key elements. If service learning has a clearly articulated partnership with a non-academic partner, then that's one element that would be necessary for service learning to happen. We know that some service learning happens without a community partner, without an organization, a non-academic organization as a partner, for example. Service learning can sometimes be sort of power over. You know, I have the resources and I feel I need to be of service to those who are less fortunate, sort of charity or savior model.
Or the old model of community outreach in a certain way.
Exactly, yes. But some people still hang on to the word service learning and have adapted to the much more power with model, where you are partnering with non-academic partners who have a stake in and some access to power over the project, and you are working towards reciprocal, mutually respectful relationships with those partners.
Excellent. Folks, I thank you so much. I think it was a perfect wrap up, because we started this day with the Secretary General of a national agency telling us about what happens right now and what can happen later. And we finished with the most systematic approach you can have through a classification for today.